Welcome back to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain. Also, cool your heels with Lillian Caldwell. Heard every Tuesday evening from 8 to 9 p.m. on AM, FM 247.com. And this morning, our special guest is Sarah Armstrong, who wrote a book called The Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce: What to Think Through when children are involved. So good morning, Sarah. How are you this, rainy day here in Pennsylvania?
Good morning, Lillian. Great to be with you.
I am delighted to have you. Divorce still is a very controversial subject here in the States and abroad, and people don't always work out things amicably. So what prompted you to write the book?
Well, actually, I want to start, Lillian, with just saying, just for the record, I'm not an advocate for divorce. In an ideal world, couples that get married stay married, and for the long term. But unfortunately, these days, that's not always the case, and divorce is more common than ever. So I just want to start with that because it's important for me to share that point. But it's interesting when you think about the topic of divorce. There's three really key things that I was reflecting on as I was thinking about writing this book. The first is that no one gets married to get divorced, and no one gets divorced for positive reasons. But children do not get to make the decision of whether their parents divorce, but their lives are significantly impacted by this decision. And so as I went through my own divorce, which actually was 10 years ago, I went through it and made a conscious decision of how we were going to go through it. And after my divorce, I had a number of girlfriends who had children and came to me and asked them to help them think through the details of their divorce. And somehow I say that the girl who never ever thought she would get a divorce has somehow become the poster child for a good divorce. So after helping my girlfriends during this challenging time in their lives, they would stop and say, Sarah, you should really write these things down. And I would stop and think about it, but I don't consider myself a writer. And so I didn't really ever intend to write a book. However, I was actually in Mexico City a number of years ago, actually in 2014, and I was at a dinner with a group of my Latin colleagues, and a colleague and friend of mine turned to me, and he said, Sarah, you're so happy. And I said, yes, I'm happy. He goes, but you're divorced. And I stopped, and I said, getting a divorce is not a death sentence. My ex-husband and I decided to no longer be married to each other. And yes, I'm happy, and my daughter Grace is happy, and my ex-husband's happy, and that is possible even though you've gone through a divorce. And I mentioned to him that my friends had been encouraging me to write a book, and he said, you really should. So the next morning I got on my flight, and I opened my laptop, and I started writing. And it's the very first line that I wrote in my book it really kind of tells the story because it reflects on the fact that this was written by a girl who never ever thought she would get a divorce, who got a divorce and what she learned along the way. And so that's really kind of the background of what led me to writing this book and wanting to share guidance with other moms out there that have children and want to think about keeping their children in mind through every step of the process to make sure that what's best for their children is the focus.
And I applaud that. I got divorced in the 1970s, and I had a child who was about a year and a half old. So he really didn't know anything because he was so young.
Yeah.
But as the years progress and ex-dad acted one way and I acted another way, questions came up. And one of the things that I did with my son is I taught him to love his father.
Yeah.
I said, whatever the problem is, it exists between me and your dad. It has nothing with you whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it's important for you to establish a relationship with him. Should you want, I'll write to him and tell him that you would like to get to know him. And I said, you do not need to talk to me about anything you do with your dad. I said, find a counselor at school or a teacher, talk to them about it. You do not need to include me in this conversation. He's remarried, has kids of his own, but you are more than welcome. And I found that was the best way to handle it.
Yep. Yeah, and it's a great point, Lillian. And I think that it is a conscious decision, right, in terms of how you want to enter into this process of divorce and how you want to manage it yourself and with your children and the reflections you want to make on your ex-spouse. It's interesting. My daughter really was the one that highlighted for me how we were approaching it and actually came and defined good divorce for me, interestingly enough. We were in a CVS picking up some things, and there was a People magazine on the counter, and it had a celebrity couple that was getting a divorce. And Grace, again, this was 1 year after we were divorced, so she's 8 years old. She looks at me and she goes, "Hey, Mommy, is that a good divorce or a bad divorce?" And I stopped and I said, "Grace, I don't know, what's the difference between a good divorce and a bad divorce?" She goes, "Well, a good divorce is when a mommy and daddy are nice to each other like you and daddy. And a bad divorce is when they scream and shout at each other." And I stopped Lillian and thought, wow, that's how she has taken this massive change in our lives, right? And she can actually categorize it that way and define it that way. And so I do think that, a good divorce means a couple can put aside their personal feelings for one another, and focus on what's best for their children. So I think it's really an important, again, mindset that you have to actually enter in when you go through a divorce.
So when you set up your book, I'm pretty sure you devoted chapters to behavior, chapters for personal, chapters, children as weapons, etc. Or did you set it up another way in order for a parent to go in, and even grandparents get caught up in the divorce? And you've got to think about these things, folks. You'd be surprised. So you must have set it up such a way that either it's building upon each previous chapter, or you set it up in such a way that a person can just open it up and go to that particular chapter, read the advice you give with no guarantees, because there's no guarantees on how people are going to adjust their behavior and their personality, which is also threatened.
Absolutely. Yeah. So actually the way that I designed the book, and so when I got divorced, actually I had a number of people give me books, and they were big and thick. I'd open them and I'd close them because they were too dense for me. There was too much there. I couldn't process it all. So when I decided to write this book, I wrote it in bite-sized pieces. Okay. And so there is a topic per page, and the topic might be a paragraph, it might be a page, but it's not really longer than that. There's a couple topics that might go a page or two, but it is really meant to be a very concise, bite-sized piece of guidance that someone can take in, a mom can take in and think about, and then they might only be able to take in a couple of points, and then they can close it and put it away until they're ready for the next pieces of guidance. And the structure of it is actually, I broke it into 3 phases: preparing for the change, during the change, and post the change. Because you are, from a mindset standpoint, only able to take in where you are, right? So much of the things that are coming at you through a divorce, there's so many things to think about. So I wanted to break it into phases, and then those bite-sized pieces, so that a mom going through divorce could take in what they need. And so the table of contents literally lists out every topic, and you can look for that specific topic that you might want to think about, and then reflect on it. I actually have a lot of white space. It's funny, in the printed version I have a lot of white space, and when I was publishing it, the editor that I was working with said, "You can put more on a page." I said, no, the white space is for people to reflect and think and have time and take notes if they need to. So it was actually very conscious in terms of the overall design of the book.
I hope you also approach the difference between separation and a divorce. I got divorced, then I remarried. The marriage lasted 30 years. My husband passed away from Alzheimer's. I'm now a single woman again, without child. He's, married and everything. But there are a lot of guys out there, ladies and gentlemen, and women too, who say they're separated. Mm-hmm. And please note the difference, that when you're separated, they're still married.
Yes. Yeah, it's an important point. And I think one of the things I speak to in the book is, the use of social media in this stage of your life, and what you're putting out there depending on where you are in the process. because everything can be viewed, and obviously you are still married. So yeah, it's a very important point. It's a very important point.
And the other thing you may want to do for your child, and I'm not saying that maybe your child needs it, but I know that at the YMCA where my child spent most of his days after and before school, they had a room that was set up, and it was padded, the walls, ceiling, floor, the whole 9 yards. And for kids who came from recently divorced parents or going through a divorce parents or before divorced parents, they would ask the kids to strip down to their underwear, and then they would put them in the room, and for 15 minutes they would allow the child to really get out anything that bugged him emotionally about what was going on.
Wow, that's powerful. That's amazing. Well, it's amazing, Lillian, when you think about it. When a couple gets divorced and children are involved, the stakes are high. And we owe it to our children to ensure that they're not collateral damage due to this divorce. And even though, as couples, we no longer want to be married to one another, we've made a commitment to our children when we brought them into this world that we would bring them up in the healthiest environment possible, right? And so I say that we cover the plugs, and we make sure they wear bike helmets, and we ensure they drink organic milk, But then, we want them to be in the safest and healthiest, happy environment possible. But then the toxicity that can come when a divorce enters the picture can have long-term impact on the children's approach to relationships, their view on marriage, and their overall happiness in life. And so there is, I really believe there's a responsibility that we have to allow our children, to your point, to express themselves and to let all of this out. And there is so much emotion that comes with this. But then it is up to us as parents to take the co-parenting of that child seriously, and with the intent of allowing them to not have this divorce define the rest of their lives. And I think one of the things that I reflect on is, divorce doesn't need to be a scarlet letter, right? It's a process you go through, and unfortunately it's a process your children have to go through, but it does not need to define your life and your children's lives in a negative light for the long term. And that's one of the real, I think, things I'm very passionate about helping to change in society is, there's not enough conversation about the topic of how to have a good divorce, and so the goal is how do we change the social norm of bitter divorces and their lasting impact on children so that, children can process what happens, but at the end of the day, parents and children can really shift to the fact that you will come through this on the other end and you can all be happy, and the fact that a good divorce is actually an attainable outcome and not something that people look at you when you say good divorce and think, what are you talking about? There's nothing good about a divorce. And it's like, well, the process of divorce isn't good, but once you get through it, you all can be okay, eventually be happy and make it through.
I also believe that should you desire to, you need to write a second book about how people live after the divorce, but they're sharing the responsibility of bringing up their kids. Because my son used to bring home stories from daycare at the Y about parents and how maybe a child preferred to live with one parent over another parent, or they lived a month here and then they went over a month there. And, of course, the influences of the adult parents also played very heavily into how the child identified themselves as.
Yes. No, I think it's great. I think your suggestion, actually, in my book, in fairness, the post-divorce phase is, and actually that's why I just have re-released the book, in fact, because now that I had originally written the book at 5 years post-divorce, I'm now 10 years post-divorce. So I actually added a number of new topics in the post-divorce phase based on the experiences of myself and the girlfriends that I'd helped through this process, that I went back and said, what else have we collectively learned over these years? So I think in the third phase of this book, it addresses many of the points that you talk about, and it is so important to think about how you are managing the day-to-day logistics of life, right? And there's so many decisions. What I like to say is there's a lot of discussions to have and decisions to make about how you want to manage your life with your child and your ex-spouse or children and ex-spouse moving forward. And a great example, I'll tell you a story that really hit home for me at the time, and I've shared it, and it really, I think, resonates, is when we were going through our divorce, we actually sat down with a child specialist before we told Grace, our daughter, that we were going to get a divorce. And he looks at me and he says, "Sarah, do you travel?" I said, "Yes, I travel internationally for my career." And he looked at my ex-husband and he said, "Do you travel?" And he said, "Yes, I travel domestically." And he said, "Well, Grace is about to become a professional traveler. She's going to travel every week for the next 11 years until she's 18 and she goes off to college." And Lily and I burst into tears right at that point. And because I thought, this is not what I want for her life. She's not choosing this, and she is going to be the most impacted in this in terms of the day-to-day logistics of how our lives are being lived. And so what we tried to do is to think about what would be the things that minimize, and make this less impactful than it could be on Grace's life. And so an example of that, and it gets down to the I would say the detailed logistics of life, is thinking about what are the basics that we're going to be at both homes, and making sure that trying to minimize the fact that Grace had to pack a bag, every week, a couple of times a week as she was shifting homes. And so whatever we could do to make it easier on her was my goal, and was our goal, actually. And so that is just an example of having to really think through things and make sure that you can acknowledge the fact that your children didn't choose this. And I use the example of those very specific special items you might only have one of. Sometimes they end up at the other house. And Grace would come down and say, my dress-up shoes are at Dad's house. And they were always, the hour before we were leaving for whatever the event was. And I'd say, and I'd have to stop and take a deep breath because, from a time frame standpoint, that wasn't ideal. But again, it wasn't Grace's fault that her dress-up shoes were at Dad's. And so I'd stop and say, okay, well, either we're going to go get them. He happens to live 10 minutes away, so that was a feasible option. Or I'd say, you know what, we'll just figure out that we'll wear something else. So not blaming her, again, not her fault, right? But I think these are the types of things that you have to really stop and think about, because every one of those moments builds upon itself over the course of a post-divorce phase, and either can become a big thing and, a big negative, or you deal with it and you move on.
And in addition to that, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things my son said to me was, how will I know if I get a divorce? And I said, it's like this, Ben. It's not how many notches you put on your belt. It's the one notch that you have in your belt. And what you do is, A, make sure you and your future wife grow in the same direction, but grow. And two, more importantly, let each other know what the other is thinking, and don't do it in the bedroom. I said, choose a neutral place, a dining room, a library, a kitchen, the car, but not the bedroom. And I said, work it out. That's why God gave you a voice to use. I said, just because I got a divorce does not mean that you're going to get a divorce. So please don't think that way. But you have to have these kind of discussions with your children, because when they start dating, and they may get involved. Listen, my son kissed a lot of frogs before he found his fairy princess.
No, and I think it's a great point, Lillian. I think that communication is essential. Communication and patience, I think, are two of the most critical things in this process. But in terms of communication amongst couples, I should mention my parents were married, or actually still, they've been married 51 years, and they are a true picture of a partnership, and I love what they've had in their life. And quite honestly, that was what I was striving for. But sometimes things don't work out that way. But I also think my daughter Grace has been able to see her grandparents and the strength of that relationship, and see what marriage can look like, and see other friends. But also, to your point earlier, she's also seen some of her friends' parents going through divorce and not necessarily maybe making some of the best decisions, and she's seen the impact on her friends. And even though she has parents that are divorced, and I know that that's not her goal in life, she can see how it could be better if those parents would take different actions in the approach that they're taking in managing the details with their children. So it's really interesting. And again, she's now 17, so she can reflect on it different than obviously when she was 7. But it has been really interesting to watch her reflections as she's watching other families go through what we went through when she was much younger, and seeing the difference that her father and I have taken versus some of her friends' parents.
But then you're talking about mature adults. And ladies and gentlemen, sometimes adults can still be children even though they're adults.
Yeah. This is true, but that's where we have to build some muscle. I agree. Maturity is a key portion, a key part of this. But I think you can, if it's not the natural inclination because of the emotion that comes with this process, one of the things I talk about, and it's a new addition to my book, is developing a compartmentalization muscle. Okay, and I talk about the fact that in society these days we talk about building our core muscles, right? We do yoga or Pilates or whatever the case is. But developing a compartmentalization muscle that allows you to put those emotions, even though they may still be with you, but to be able to put them aside and not allow them to be the focus of what you're bringing your children into every day. And I had a friend who had a great analogy of, she said, I take my emotions and I put them in a box and I put them up in the attic and I lock the door. And there's some days when I want to, feel those emotions and wallow in that. And so I go up in the attic and I get that box and I pull it down and I stay there and I sit with the emotions. But I think the key is that you need to consciously know when you can close that box up and put it back, because your children are watching you. And if all they see is you living in the past and rehashing the past versus looking ahead to what is possible and what the potential of the future holds, it's not just you that is being weighed down by this divorce, but your children are actually going to stay in that space with you. And it's not a healthy place. I mean, you need to deal with your emotions. Everyone does, and your children need to deal with their emotions. But it should not be something that is where you live every day. You need to work through those and compartmentalize them so that you can move forward.
And another analogy you could use is I told my son, those chains that Marley from Dickens carries around with him? And he said, yeah. I said, I chose not to weigh you down with those chains from my previous marriage, because one has nothing to do with you.
Right.
So you can go out and forge your own chains, and you probably will, but you will not get any chains from me.
Oh, that's so interesting, Lily. It's a great analogy. And it's so interesting because when you think about that message that you've given your son and the approach that my ex-husband and I took to our divorce, we did not want to leave either chains or even like remnants that Grace would have to look back on and think, gosh, that's something my parents did during the divorce and stuck with them. And I'll give you a story that really is something that I've reflected on over the years. Is one of the things when you go through divorce is the children's physical environment can be really pulled apart, right? They're the home that they lived in they might not be in the same home, or if you stay in the same home, a lot of times there's obviously a divvying up of furniture and artwork and whatever the case, and your home can be pulled apart. And so in our instance, I was staying in the house where we had lived as a family, and we have a hallway with a wall of black and white family photos of both my ex-husband's family, my family, and it was a really beautiful display of our collective lives. And when we got divorced, I decided that obviously I wanted to have my ex-husband take the photos of his family with him. But what I had to stop and think about is, okay, I need to go and get some other photos that I can put up there. And so it was a project. It took some time, but I went and found other photos of my family, found photos of Grace, and I got them framed. And then Grace, again, was 7 when we got divorced, so I sent her down the street for a play date on a Sunday afternoon. And I took the photos of my ex-husband's family off the wall. I put these new photos up, and then Grace came home. And I'm in the kitchen, and she comes home, and within about 2 to 3 minutes, I hear her call me from the hallway. She goes, "Hey, Mommy." And I go, "What's that, Grace?" She said, and I kind of stopped, and she goes, "The wall has changed." And I thought, oh, gosh. And I said, "Well, what's changed?" She said, "There are more pictures There are more pictures of me up there. It looks great." And she ran upstairs to go to her room. And Lillian, I stopped and I thought, oh my gosh, because it could have been a very different takeaway, right, that she would have had of that moment. But what I can reflect on is if I hadn't taken the effort to put new pictures up there, and I'd just taken the pictures of her father's family down and left those little hangers on the wall, what she would have remembered years later is that my parents got divorced. My mom took the pictures of my dad's family off the wall, and those little hangers hung there because she didn't put any other pictures up. And that would be that visual image, right, of our world kind of, and it's just a representation of our world being pulled apart. And I just didn't want that. So again, a conscious effort that did take effort, but I feel like it was the right thing to do to allow it to have the least impact on Grace that this change was taking place.
And I think you're right. Life changes. And ladies and gentlemen, if you think she's being not fair, let me tell you another story. My son and I, when we got divorced from my first husband, I kind of fell about 12 notches on the financial scale, to put it bluntly. And yet at the same time, I had not been brought up to go into the world to be a earner. I had been brought up to be, as we say in the 50s, barefoot and pregnant. So we really started out at a very low economic level, but that in no way impacted my son. I made sure that there was always enough to not only put food on the table, but enable him to do what he loved, which is drawing, and now he's a world famous, drawer person. But the point I'm trying to make is just because you're served a dish of lemons or limes, for when a divorce happens and your ex-husband, for whatever the reason, cannot give you the alimony or child support that you are demanding, does not mean that your child or children need to suffer because of it, and with you invoking the ex-partner's name nastily.
Yep. 100% agree. Yep. 100% agree.
Because it's important for your child to realize that you can, no matter how meager, you can provide for them.
Yeah. And I think that the gift we can give our children, and I think this is really important during divorce, is our time. And focusing on them and giving them special moments. And again, a special moment can be just going to the park and spending time having fun, or walking the streets of the city you live in and noticing different things. It does not need to take money to do that. But I think one of the things that I've heard from many divorced moms that I've spoken to is they feel very stretched in terms of all the things that they're trying to accomplish during this time frame, which is completely understandable. But what our children really need during this phase of their lives is our presence and us being there for them to talk or reflect or just quietly be together, whatever the case may be. But putting our technology away and really being with them is an important point, especially as we're going through this change.
Absolutely. And ladies and gentlemen, back in the 70s, I had an understanding with Barnes & Noble and with a comic book gentleman who owned his own comic book store, and I knew I could deposit my little boy in their premises, and he'd just be happy reading books or comic books all day, which would free me up to do other things that needed to get done. Something you guys should think about. You'd be surprised how proprietors of different stores who have a lot of kids coming in and reading their books are delighted to keep an eye out while you run, because they do understand the situation, because many of them are in the same situation.
Yeah. As I say, it takes. I mean, it takes all of us to support each other as we're going through this. And looking for that and building that support network is actually something I talk about in the book, in terms of defining what your support network is and who can help you through this process, both during the process but afterwards is equally important, because it is a different structure in terms of co-parenting with an ex-husband, but also the single nature of what you're doing with your children. and finding how you can structure that support to work for you.
Now, I suppose you also have a chapter dealing with your ex having a new girlfriend or a new lady in his life, or a gentleman, if you are gay, maybe another male partner, or women, if you're gay, another female partner, and how you would handle that as well.
Yes. So I talk about, how to think about how your children are engaging with the significant others. I talk about how you, as the ex-spouse of your ex-husband or ex-wife, is engaging or not with the significant other. Those are choices you need to make. Even how you engage with the grandparents and the extended family is a consideration. And I've seen all sorts of different models. Again, there's not one model right out there in terms of how families are structured these days. And so it really is up to you to think through what works for you and for your children and how you want that to be structured moving forward. But again, these are discussions and decisions that have to be made around each of the topics. I even say, how do you want to display? I talk about displaying photos of your ex-spouse in your children's rooms. I mean, Grace has a wall. Again, I like, you can tell I like photos, but in Grace's room, there's a wall of photos of both of our families. Her father's family and her grandparents and aunts and uncles, and then my side of the family, because that's her family. Just because we got divorced doesn't mean those pictures can't be there for her to reflect on it and make her smile. So I think there's again the ex-in-laws, the significant others, all of those, both in terms of how you interact with them in person and not how they are represented in the physical environment of your children, is something to think about.
So, Sarah, please tell everybody where they can find you and your book and anything else coming along that you want to brag about.
Well, great. Thank you. So you can find my book on Amazon or on Barnes & Noble. It's available both in paperback and in iBooks, Kindle, and Nook. I do appreciate that some people might not want to walk around with paperback of this if you're in a reflection mode and need to maybe not have it be as visible, so it is available in the digital form. And then I have a website called www.gooddivorce.guide, GUIDE, and that's where it gives a bit more background on my book and further points. I have some blog posts there as well. So, I just, at the end of the day, Lillian, my hope is that there is a potential to help society understand that the concept of a good divorce is an attainable outcome, and that we can shift perception and actually make the social norm where when someone hears the term good divorce, they don't look at you and think, I don't understand how that's possible. It should be something that everyone believes is possible.
Absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't heard all of this interview or you just simply want to hear it all over again, that's quite simple. You can go over to https://passionateworldtalkradio.com, right-hand side menu. Scroll down to Cool Your Heels, click on it, and voila, there it is. It will also be converted into video on YouTube. It will be on iHeart. It will be on Alexa. It will be on Spotify, Podchaser, Podcatcher, you name it, it will be there. So please take a listen. If you're not digitally inclined or you're older and you don't have a tablet or a cell phone or a desktop or a laptop, we provide you with a Sizzle line. A Sizzle line is a phone. We give you a phone number. Call up the phone number. As soon as your phone number is completed, you will start hearing the interview. And before we go away and stray, Emerson had this to say in 1860, we find delight in the beauty and happiness of children that makes the heart too big for the body. So thank you all very much for listening, and remember, please keep listening. Thank you.